It was the summer of 1971, and the air above the Harlan County Fairgrounds in Alma, Nebraska smelled like diesel smoke and something older, something that had no name but every farmer in that crowd would have recognized immediately. It smelled like a reckoning. The man standing beside the old tractor didn't speak. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, not when the laughter started, not when the comments rolled through the crowd like a wave, not even when the young John Deere dealer in the pressed green shirt walked over and said loud enough for everybody to hear, "Somebody tell the old-timer the war's been over for 25 years. Maybe it's time to retire the equipment too." The crowd laughed, a long, easy laugh, the kind that rolls out of people when they think they're watching something harmless. The old man in the worn canvas jacket just looked at his tractor. Then he looked at the track. Then he put on his gloves, slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he has done something 10,000 times and has nothing left to prove to anyone but himself. He climbed up, he settled in, he let out one long breath. And then that old machine, a 1948 McCormick Farmall M, that had spent the better part of 2 decades pulling stumps and breaking hardpan, came alive. Let me take you back to Harlan County, Nebraska in the summer of 1971. This was Midwest America at a peculiar crossroads. The great agricultural expansion of the post-war years was still rolling forward. New money was arriving in farming communities, big combines, bigger loans, bigger talk. John Deere had just introduced its Generation II cab tractor line. International Harvester was fighting for market share with everything it had. Farmers were being told from every direction that the old ways were finished, that horsepower and debt were the future. That if your equipment wasn't new, you weren't serious. Harlan County sits in the southwest corner of Nebraska, pressed up against the Kansas border, the Republican River curving through its low, wide valleys like a slow thought. The land there is not dramatic. It doesn't inspire poetry the way the sandhills do further north. It is simply present, flat and honest and demanding, the way good farmland usually is. In 1971, there were roughly 4,200 people in the entire county. Nearly all of them, in some way or another, made their living from the soil. The Harlan County Fair had been running since 1903. By 1971, the tractor pull had become its centerpiece event. Men came from 4 counties over. Women packed picnic baskets. Children ran barefoot through the grass. And farmers, proud, competitive, deeply private men, brought their machines to be tested in front of God and everyone. The pull was held on a Saturday in late July. The temperature that afternoon had climbed to 94 degrees. The sky was the color of old denim, pale at the edges where the heat had worn it thin. The grandstand held maybe 600 people. Another 300 stood along the fence line, arms folded, watching. This is the place. This is the day. And the story that unfolded here, quiet as it began, quiet as it ended, is one that the people of Harlan County carried with them for the rest of their lives. Let me tell you about Earl Mossgrove. Earl was 61 years old in the summer of 1971, which meant he had been born in 1910, the year the steam engine was still king and a man's worth was measured by how straight he could plow a furrow without looking back. He had grown up in Harlan County. His father had farmed it. His grandfather had broken the original sod on the family's quarter section outside of Republican City, back when the grass still came up to a man's chest in June. Earl had served in the Pacific. He didn't talk about it. Nobody who knew him well ever asked him to. He came home in 1945 with a Purple Heart, a slight limp in his left leg from something that had happened on an island whose name most Nebraskans couldn't have found on a map, and a quietness in him that had not been there before he left. He took over the farm from his father in 1948, 160 acres of bottom ground along the Republican River. Good soil, dark and deep, the kind of Nebraska soil that holds moisture and gives back what you put into it. Earl raised corn, milo, and a small herd of Angus cattle that he kept in the north pasture. He had a vegetable garden that his wife, Lorne, kept with an attention to detail that rivaled any agriculture in the county. He was not a wealthy man, not in 1971, not ever, really. His farmhouse was built in 1924 and the kitchen still had the original linoleum. His pickup truck was a 1961 Ford F-100 with a cracked windshield that he'd been meaning to replace for 3 years. His barn needed paint on the north side. These were the quiet marks of a man who kept everything running but never had quite enough left over to make anything shine. What Earl Mossgrove did have, and this is the part that matters, was a 1948 McCormick Farmall M. He had bought it new the year he came back from the war. He had run it for 23 years without a single major failure. He maintained it the way a watchmaker maintains a fine movement, cleaning it, adjusting it, understanding every sound it made and what that sound meant. He had rebuilt the carburetor twice. He had rebored the cylinders once in the winter of 1959 in his own shop with a set of tools he'd mail-ordered from Sears. He had retimed the magneto more times than he could count. The Farmall M was not a glamorous machine. It had never been. It put out 36 horsepower at the drawbar in factory trim, which by 1971 standards made it something between a relic and a punchline. The new tractors coming off the line that year were pushing 100, 120, even 150 horsepower. Men were buying them on 30-year notes and feeling like the future had finally arrived. Earl's tractor was red, a deep, sun-aged red that had faded in places to something closer to brick. The front tires were narrowed, close together in the classic tricycle configuration that Farmall had made famous. The rear tires were wide and knobbed, and when you looked at them, you could see the history of 23 harvests in the way they'd worn. He had entered it in the antique class at the Harlan County Fair pool. That was the class for machines 20 years old or older. The purse wasn't much, first place paid $85, but Earl hadn't entered for the money. He had entered because the Farmall M deserved to be seen. And because Earl Mossgrove, quiet as he was, believed that some things needed to be demonstrated rather than explained. Now let me tell you about Dale Fenwick. Dale was 33 years old in 1971, young, sharp, hungry, and he had recently been named the regional sales manager for Bremer Farm Equipment, the John Deere dealership out of McCook, which was the largest ag equipment dealer in a 4-county radius. He drove a new 1971 Oldsmobile Delta 88 white with a green stripe along the fender, and he wore a green John Deere golf shirt tucked into pressed khaki trousers even on weekends. He had grown up in Lincoln. He had a degree in agricultural business from the University of Nebraska. He knew the specifications of every machine in the John Deere lineup from memory. He could quote horsepower ratings, PTO output, fuel consumption, and financing terms in the same breath. He was very good at his job, and he knew it, and he believed that knowing it gave him permission to say things that other men might have thought but had the decency to keep quiet. Dale had brought 2 machines to the pool that day, both of them entered in the open class. A brand new 1971 John Deere 4020 94 horsepower diesel fresh off the lot with the decals still bright, and a 1969 Deere 3020 that he'd pulled from the dealership's demonstration fleet and modified with a set of wheel weights and a modified intake that pushed the output closer to 80 horses. He was not entered in the antique class. He had no business in the antique class. But Dale Fenwick had a talent for finding his way into situations where he had no business being. He had walked the line of antique tractors early that afternoon, hands in his pockets, doing the thing that men like him do, cataloging, evaluating, dismissing. He had paused at an old Minneapolis Moline and nodded with theatrical appreciation. He had stopped at a case vac and made a comment about its drawbar height that showed, genuinely, that he knew his machines. And then he had come to Earl Mossgrove's Farmall M. He had looked at it for a long time. Then he had looked at Earl. And then to the 2 men standing with him, both fellow dealers, both from out of county, he had said, loud and easy, as though Earl were not standing right there. You know what the difference is between that old M and a brand new 4020? About 30 years and a man who knew when to quit. The 2 men with him had laughed. A few bystanders had caught the comment and smiled. Earl Mossgrove had heard every word. He had not looked up from what he was doing, which was checking the air pressure in his rear left tire with a small gauge he kept in his breast pocket. He checked it, noted what he found, and put the gauge back in his pocket. He did not say a word. And somehow, and this is the thing that the people who were there would remember later, somehow, Dale Fenwick seemed to find Earl's silence more irritating than any comeback could have been. The antique class pull was scheduled for 2:00 in the afternoon. By 1:45, the track had been freshly dragged, the way sled was in position, and the crowd had swelled along the fence line. The heat was serious now, the kind of Nebraska summer heat that sits on your shoulders and makes the air above the track shimmer in visible waves. There were 7 machines entered in the antique class that year. Earl's Farmall M was the oldest. The newest was a 1951 Oliver 88 entered by a man named Gerald Totham from out near Beaver City. Most of the machines were in the 35 to 45 horsepower range, the working tractors of the 1940s, the machines that had built the post-war Midwest one furrow at a time. The pull works like this: the tractor hooks to a weighted sled. As the tractor moves forward, the sled's weight transfers toward the front, increasing the drag. A full pull means dragging the sled the entire length of the track, roughly 300 feet in the Harlan County setup. A short pull means the tractor ran out of power before the finish line. The machine that moves the sled the farthest wins. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a crowd that doesn't realize it's about to see something it will never forget? That's the feeling that hung over those 600 people in that grandstand at 1:55 in the afternoon on a Saturday in July 1971. Not anticipation exactly. More like the stillness before a weather shift. The way the air changes before something decides to happen. Earl had backed his Farmall M to the hook. He'd done it in one clean motion, no wasted movement, the front tires barely wobbling on the hardpack. The chain was set. The drawbar was in position. Dale Fenwick had drifted over to the fence near the start line, green shirt bright in the afternoon sun, and he had said, again, just loud enough, somebody ought to tell the fair board that the antique class is for tractors, not museum pieces. A man next to him chuckled, a woman nearby did not. Earl sat on his tractor and looked at the track ahead of him. He did not look at Dale Fenwick. He had not looked at Dale Fenwick once all afternoon. The announcer, a heavyset man named Leroy Schraber who'd been calling the Harlan County poll for 9 years, came over the PA system with that particular combination of competence and enthusiasm that small county announcers develop over time. He ran through the rules. He acknowledged the machines. He called Earl's name and the make and year of his tractor, and there was a round of applause from the grandstand, the genuine kind, the kind that older crowds give to older things out of real respect. And then from somewhere near the fence, distinct and carrying, hope that old relic can make it to the finish line before it falls apart. Laughter scattered, uncomfortable at the edges. Earl Mossgrove put his hands on the steering wheel. He did not turn around. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, 3 seconds. People who were watching closely would remember it later. And then he opened them. And he looked at the 300 feet of track in front of him, the way a man looks at something he has already finished. Now, this is the part of the story where I need to slow down. Because what happened next doesn't make sense unless you understand what Earl Mossgrove had been doing for the 6 months before that July afternoon. Earl had not entered the Harlan County poll on impulse. Earl Mossgrove did not do anything on impulse. He had thought about it since January, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of Lawrence coffee and a copy of Successful Farming magazine open in front of him, reading an article about the mechanical capabilities of the old Farmall M series. What he had read and what he had then spent the winter confirming in his own shop was this. The 1948 McCormick Farmall M from the factory was governed to produce 36 horsepower at the drawbar. It was governed that way not because the engine couldn't produce more, but because International Harvester needed the machine to have a long service life in hard working conditions, and running an engine at its ceiling continuously is a reliable way to shorten that life. Earl had known this in a general way for years. What he hadn't known, until he read that article and then spent 3 months corresponding with a machinist in Omaha named Roy Vandermeer who specialized in old international equipment, was the specific details of what the M's engine was actually capable of when the governor was properly adjusted and the fuel system was optimized. Roy Vandermeer had explained it in careful letters, written in a precise mechanical hand on Vandermeer machine works stationery. The M's engine, the 264 cubic inch gasoline 4-cylinder, was significantly underworked in its factory configuration. With the governor adjusted within the mechanical tolerances of the original design, Roy had been careful to emphasize, and with the carburetor rejetted and the ignition timing advanced to account for the load, the engine could produce output considerably beyond the factory rating. Not dangerously. Not at the expense of longevity, but beyond what any factory specification sheet would tell you. Earl had done the work himself as he did all his own work. He had the letters from Roy Vandermeer. He had the specifications. He had spent February, March, and April in his shop, working by the light of 2 shop lamps, adjusting and testing and adjusting again. He had pulled the carburetor and rejetted it. He had advanced the magneto timing. He had gone over every gasket, every seal, every fuel line with the attention of a man who understood that the details were the entire thing. He had not told anyone what he had done. Not Lorne, not his neighbor, Carl Specht, who he'd asked to help him haul the tractor to the fairgrounds that morning. Not the fair officials when he registered. Let me tell you about the moment Earl knew his work had been done right. It was a Tuesday evening in May. He had taken the Farmall M out to the south field, the hard ground section along the fence line that had always been difficult pulling, clay-heavy and reluctant. He had put it in a gear he had never used on that ground before. He had let out the clutch. The tractor had moved forward without hesitation, through ground that had always made it labor. The exhaust note had changed, deepened, steadied, taken on a rhythm that Earl recognized as an engine operating at full authority rather than comfortable effort. He had driven 3 rounds of that field in the evening light, the smell of turned earth rising around him, and when he came to a stop at the fence line and shut the engine down, he had sat for a minute in the sudden quiet. Then he had nodded once, to the tractor, to himself, to the evening. And he had driven it home. Leroy Schreiber counted down over the PA, the crowd settled, the afternoon seemed to hold its breath. The flag dropped, and Earl let out the clutch. Now, and this is important, a tractor pull does not look the way most people expect it to. There is no explosion of speed, there is no dramatic surge. What there is commitment. The tractor hooks into the load and either commits to it or it doesn't. What you're watching is a contest of torque against inertia, played out at about 3 miles an hour, and the drama of it is entirely in the sound and the movement and the way the machine either pushes forward or begins to slow. When Earl's Farmall M engaged the sled, the exhaust note dropped a full register. It went from the light, rapid pop of an idling 4-cylinder to something lower, heavier, more deliberate. A sound that older men in the crowd recognized the way they recognized the sound of a handshake from someone who meant it. The tractor moved forward, steadily, without drama, the way a river moves when it has decided where it's going. At 50 feet, the sled's weight had transferred enough that several of the earlier pulls had begun to falter. Earl's M did not falter. At 100 feet, Leroy Schreiber's voice took on a new quality over the PA, not surprise exactly, but the particular aliveness of a man who realizes he may be watching something worth remembering. The crowd had gone from casual to attentive. Arms that had been folded came down. People who had been talking stopped. 600 people in a grandstand began doing the thing that crowds do when they sense something real is happening. They leaned forward, almost in unison. The gentle, unconscious lean of people being pulled by something they didn't expect. At 150 feet, the halfway mark, Earl Mossgrove had matched the longest pull of the day. A 1950 John Deere AR owned by a man from Franklin County had gone 148 feet before the wheels broke loose. It had been, until that moment, the pull to beat. Earl's M continued. The exhaust note had not changed. Not a flutter, not a hesitation. It had found its rhythm, and it maintained it with the steadiness of something that had been built to work and had never been asked to do anything else. At 200 feet, the grandstand began to make noise. Not cheering, not yet, more like the sound of people exhaling. The sound of 600 people realizing they'd been holding their breath. Dale Fenwick was at the fence, 10 yards from the track. He had started watching with his arms crossed and a half-smile on his face, the expression of a man watching entertainment he has already categorized. At 50 feet he had still been smiling. At 100 feet the smile had become thoughtful. At 150 feet he had uncrossed his arms. At 200 feet he was gripping the fence rail with both hands. The Farmall M kept going. 220 feet. 240. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a man prove something that he never once announced he was going to prove? There is a specific kind of dignity in that, a specific kind of power. Because he didn't prove it to anyone, he proved it in front of everyone, and that's a different thing entirely. You can argue with what a man says. You cannot argue with what a machine does on a measured track in front of 600 witnesses. 260 feet. The sled was transferring near its maximum load now. This is the zone where even the strongest pulls tend to slow, where the tires begin to lose their bite and spin on the hardpack. The crowd knew this. The men along the fence knew this. They watched the rear tires for the first sign of breaking loose. The rear tires did not break loose. Earl Mossgrove sat on that tractor the way he always sat on it, straight-backed, steady, hands on the wheel without white-knuckling it. He was not celebrating, he was not performing, he was working. He was doing what he had prepared to do, and the machine beneath him was doing what he had prepared it to do, and the two of them, old man and old machine, were simply going about the business of finishing what they had started. 280 feet. The grandstand noise had climbed now, and it had taken on a specific quality, the kind of sound that starts in the throat and doesn't have a clean word attached to it. Not a cheer exactly. A release. A communal release of something that had been building from the moment the flag dropped. The Farmall M crossed the 300-foot mark. A full pull. The only full pull in the antique class that day. Leroy Schreiber's voice came over the PA, and you could hear in it, even through the tinny speakers of the 1971 Harlan County Fairgrounds system. You could hear the real thing, the genuine thing, the thing that people sometimes feel when they witness something they were not expecting to feel. Full pull for Earl Mosgrove of Republican City, Nebraska. That is a full pull, ladies and gentlemen. The grandstand came up. All 600 of them. And then something happened that Leroy Schreiber would talk about for the rest of his life. The cheering peaked, and then it settled, not the way cheering usually settles, gradually, comfortably, letting itself down easy. It settled the way a room settles when something has just happened that needs to be respected. The crowd did not sit back down all at once. They came back to their seats slowly, individually, and a quiet moved through the fairground that was different from the silence before the pull. That silence had been anticipatory. This silence was something else. It was the silence of 600 people privately reconsidering something they had assumed. Dale Fenwick was still at the fence rail. He had let go of it at some point. He couldn't have said exactly when, and he was standing with his hands at his sides, watching Earl Mosgrove unhook the Farmall M from the sled's chain. Earl worked the hook with the same deliberate efficiency he brought to every physical task. He backed the tractor off the chain. He pulled forward. He drove it back toward the line of antique machines at the south end of the grounds. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Dale Fenwick. He drove back to his spot in the line, shut the engine down, and climbed off. He took a clean rag from his back pocket and wiped down the steering wheel and the top of the instrument panel, a habit of 23 years. He folded the rag and put it back in his pocket. Carl Specht, his neighbor, was waiting for him. Carl was a man of about Earl's generation, a farmer from up near Oxford, and when Earl walked up, Carl put his hand on Earl's shoulder and said something quietly that nobody else heard. Earl nodded once. That was all. The two men stood together beside the tractor and watched the rest of the antique class finish its pulls, and they didn't say much, and they didn't need to. Leroy Schreiber announced the results a few minutes later. Earl Mosgrove, 1948 McCormick Farmall M, full pull 300 feet, first place antique class, prize $85. More applause from the grandstand, genuine and warm and unhurried. Dale Fenwick had drifted away from the fence by then. One of the men who'd been with him earlier found him near the concession stand, buying a Pepsi. He didn't say much about the pull. He said the heat was something. He said he needed to check on his machines before the open class. He did not go back to the south end of the grounds where the antique tractors were parked. He did not seek out Earl Mosgrove. And Earl Mosgrove did not seek out Dale Fenwick. Because Earl Mosgrove had never been trying to say anything to Dale Fenwick. He had never been trying to prove anything to Dale Fenwick. He had entered that poll for the same reason he had done most things in his 61 years, because something mattered and he was going to do it right. And the audience for that had always been himself and his own conscience and maybe, occasionally, the God he talked to quietly during long hours on a tractor. What Dale Fenwick thought was, in Earl Mosgrove's estimation, none of Earl Mosgrove's business. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed. The story of the Harlan County pool spread the way stories spread in rural Nebraska in 1971, by word of mouth, at grain elevators and farm equipment auctions and church basements, carried from one county to the next by the particular telegraph of rural social networks that predates the internet by a century and works, if anything, better. By the end of that summer, people in 4 counties had heard some version of what Earl Mosgrove and his Farmall M had done at the Harlan County Fair. The details varied. In some versions, the crowd was larger, the pull was longer, the deer dealer had said something worse. But the core of it stayed true, the way true things tend to. An old man with an old machine had done something that nobody expected. And he had done it without making a speech about it. Earl continued farming his quarter section on the Republican River. In 1972 and 1973, during the great commodity price surge that followed Nixon's grain deal with the Soviets, corn went to levels that would have seemed fantastical a decade earlier. Earl sold his crop at $2.28 a bushel in the fall of 1973, not the peak, but close enough, and used the proceeds to pay off the last of the note on the farm that his father had taken in 1931. The farm was clear of debt for the first time in 42 years. He did not expand. He did not take on more acres. He did not do what many of his neighbors did in those fat years, borrow against the land's inflated value and plant fence post to fence post. He had seen enough to know that what goes up in agriculture tends to come down, and that the men who survive the down years are usually the ones who didn't assume the up years would last forever. He was right about that. When the farm crisis hit in the early 1980s, When land values collapsed and interest rates climbed above 20%, and farms started going under at a rate this country hadn't seen since the Depression, Earl Mossgrove's farm held. It held because there was no debt on it to call due. It held because Earl had never mortgaged his future to buy the future's approval. The Farmall M ran until 1979. That winter, the crankshaft finally gave out, not a failure of maintenance, but simply the completion of a long life well lived. Earl had the engine rebuilt that spring, in the same shop in Omaha where Roy Vandermeer's son now worked. It cost him $340 in parts and another $180 in labor. He had the tractor running again by May of 1980, and he used it for light work, moving hay bales, pulling the utility wagon, the kinds of tasks that didn't require a modern machine's power but still required a machine that started and ran without complaint. He entered the Harlan County poll again in 1972 and 1973. He won both years. In 1974, the antique class was restructured and the Farmall M was moved into a higher displacement category that made it compete against larger machines. Earl finished second that year, not because the tractor couldn't compete, but because a man from Furness County had done to his own old Oliver 88 what Earl had done to his M, and had done it slightly better. Earl shook the man's hand at the end of the pull, and when people nearby expected him to look disappointed, he looked instead like a man who has just watched someone do something the right way. He looked satisfied. Lorne Mossgrove passed away in March of 1978, quietly, from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning. Earl was with her. He buried her in the cemetery outside Republican City, in the section where both their families had buried their dead for generations, and he planted a small rose bush at the foot of the marker that he tended every year until the year he couldn't anymore. He continued farming. His son Dennis had moved back from Lincoln in 1975 with his wife Karen, and they had taken over the heavier operations, but Earl remained on the farm. He got up at 5 every morning. He drank his coffee at the kitchen table and he watched the light come up over the river bottom, and then he went to work. In 1984, at the height of the farm crisis, a reporter from the Omaha World-Herald did a series on farms that had survived the economic collapse without foreclosure. She came to Earl's place outside Republican City and spent an afternoon with him. She asked him how he had managed to hold on when so many others hadn't. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I never bought anything I couldn't pay for, and I never borrowed against tomorrow because I was impressed with today." She printed that line in the paper. People cut it out. It's probably still tucked into a Bible or a kitchen drawer somewhere in southwestern Nebraska. Dale Fenwick left Bremer Farm Equipment in 1975. He'd had a run of good years in the early 70s, moved a lot of iron during the commodity boom, made good money on commission. When the market shifted and farmers started pulling back from new equipment purchases, the dealership tightened up, and Dale moved on to a regional management position for a farm supply company in Kansas City. He did well enough. He built a life. He was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was a man of his time and his assumptions, which is the most common kind of villain there is. Whether he ever thought about that July afternoon in Harlan County is not something the record tells us, but the people who were there remember, and the things they remember have a specific quality, not bitterness, not triumph, more like the memory of watching something settle into its right place, the memory of a thing that was true. Let me close with something simple. We live in a world that is very good at noise, at announcements and demonstrations and declarations and positioning, at telling people what we're about to do before we do it and what we just did after we've done it and why it matters and what you should think about it. We are very practiced at this. Earl Mossgrove was not practiced at this. He was practiced at something else entirely. He was practiced at doing the work. Not the work of impressing people. Not the work of proving people wrong, though he did that as a byproduct, as an afterthought, almost accidentally. The work of understanding the thing in front of him, a machine, a field, a problem, well enough to do it justice. The work of preparation that nobody sees, in winter shops and correspondence with machinists and careful evenings, in a south field testing something quietly before it needed to work in public. There is a line that gets quoted sometimes, attributed to various people but true regardless of its origin. The best revenge is a life well lived. I don't think Earl would have used the word revenge. He wasn't thinking about Dale Fenwick on that February evening when he pulled the carburetor off the Farmall M by the light of his shop lamps. He wasn't thinking about the crowd when he retimed the magneto. He was thinking about the machine. He was thinking about doing it right. That was the whole of it. And here's what I want you to sit with, because I think it's the most important thing in this story. The people who laughed that afternoon, they're not bad people. Some of them probably felt a little ashamed of themselves later. Some of them carried that afternoon with them as a kind of lesson, privately, in the years that followed. When they were tempted to dismiss something because of how it looked, or how old it was, or who it belonged to, sometimes they remembered the July afternoon when a 61-year-old veteran with a 23-year-old tractor went 300 feet on a hard-packed track in 94-degree heat, and they thought twice. That's not nothing, that's actually quite a lot. The old machines and the quiet men, they're connected, I think, in a way that goes past function. The Farmall M was not just a tool, it was an embodiment of a set of values: reliability, careful maintenance, respect for what was built well, resistance to the idea that newer automatically means better. Earl didn't keep that tractor out of sentiment. He kept it because it was good and he had made it better, and good things deserve to be kept. In the years since, American agriculture has changed in ways that Earl Mossgrove couldn't have imagined and might not have liked. The farms have gotten bigger and the farmers have gotten fewer. The machines cost as much as a house, then as much as 3 houses, and the financing terms that come with them are long and complicated and loaded with risk that doesn't always show up in the sales brochure. Some of this change has been necessary. Some of it has been progress in the real sense of that word. But some of what has been lost, the knowledge of how a particular machine sounds when it's working right, the patience to understand something deeply rather than replace it quickly, the pride of a man who knows how to do something and does it without announcing it, some of that is worth mourning and worth remembering. The Harlan County Fair still runs. The tractor pull still happens on the last Saturday of July. If you were there today, you'd see machines that Earl Mossgrove wouldn't recognize: modern iron, computerized, sophisticated in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1971. But in the antique class, and there is still an antique class because there will always be people who understand why that matters, you will still see the old red Farmalls, the old Cases, the old Olivers. And the men and women who tend them have the same look about them that Earl had. A knowledge that doesn't need to announce itself. A patience that has been earned through years of quiet, careful work. And every once in a while, not always, but often enough, one of those old machines will surprise the crowd. It always surprises the crowd. It never surprises the person who took care of it.